April 10th, 1945, 22,000 feet above Germany. The sky was gold and cold, the kind of air that bit through the flight suit no matter how tight you zipped it. 4 P-51 Mustangs of the 356th Fighter Group streaked east, sunlight burning across their polished wings like fire on chrome. Inside the lead plane, Lieutenant Jack Reynolds checked his gauges, fuel low, manifold pressure steady, coolant temperature climbing. Below them, the war was ending. On the ground, cities burned in silence, but up here, the Luftwaffe still had one last trick: jets. The Me-262 seconds were fast, too fast. The manual said, never chase a jet. Break off, climb, regroup. Jack had read that line 100 times. He'd watched 3 friends vanish in flames because they followed it. Now, his radar screen pulsed once, then twice, something moving at 600 miles an hour, cutting across their flight path. A German jet. Break formation, his squadron leader shouted. Jack didn't answer. He saw the blur of metal flash through the sun ahead and felt something twist in his gut. The sky wasn't supposed to belong to jets. Not yet. Not today. He pushed the throttle forward until it hit the red gate. The Merlin engine screamed. The airframe shuddered. The whole plane vibrated as if the wings themselves begged him to stop. But he didn't. The Mustang dove into the sunlight, chasing a shadow that should have been untouchable. Inside the cockpit, the air grew thin. Jack's breathing turned ragged behind the oxygen mask. Sweat pooled under his helmet. Every rivet on the canopy hummed. The altimeter spun down 20,000 feet. 18,000. 15,000. He remembered the line from training. You can't outrun a jet. Maybe not, he thought. But maybe you could outthink one. At 505 miles per hour, the Mustang broke through its own limits. The dials quivered. The wings flexed. The air screamed like tearing metal. For a heartbeat, Jack saw the Me-262 dead ahead, black smoke trailing from its engines. And in that instant between control and chaos, one thought cut through the roar. If speed decides who rules the sky, then today, let's see who truly does. The clock on his panel read 10:42 a.m., April 10th, 1945, and the sunlight over northern Germany looked almost peaceful, the kind of morning that made the sky seem endless until you realized how quickly it could turn into a grave. The Mustang trembled as Jack eased out of his dive, condensation streaking across the canopy like veins of frost, his oxygen mask pressed tight against his skin, each breath dry and mechanical. Far below, rivers curled like silver wires through the countryside, and the faint smoke of anti-aircraft fire drifted upward in slow, lazy spirals that looked deceptively harmless. Radio static crackled in his headset, bursts of voices breaking through the hiss call signs, altitude checks, fragments of fear disguised as procedure. Red 2? Status? Someone asked, but no one answered fast enough. The formation had stretched thin, sunlight flashing off wings in staggered glints, each pilot trying to stay alive while pretending the sky still belonged to them. Jack's left hand hovered over the throttle, his right resting on the control stick, fingers slick with sweat despite the freezing air. He leveled at 19,000 feet, nose pointed east, heart still pounding from the dive. His instruments blurred slightly as the vibrations settled into a steady hum, the Merlin engine sounding like a saw cutting through the wind itself. Through the canopy, he could see vapor trails, thin white scars drawn by the jet far ahead, shifting left and right, impossible angles that only raw power could make. Every instinct told him to turn away, to climb back to safety and regroup. But instinct was what had been getting men killed since the Me-262 seconds appeared. For weeks they had been ghosts in daylight, slashing through bomber streams, too fast to chase, too deadly to ignore. Command briefings called them a temporary threat, but every pilot knew better. When those silver arrows came screaming through formation, they left only wreckage and silence. Jack had watched one slice of B-17 inches half 3 days earlier, 2 engines ripped away before the crew even had time to bail out. He thought about that as he checked his ammunition count, 280 rounds left in each wing gun, enough for maybe 6 seconds of fire. The Mustang's nose twitched slightly in the crosswind, sunlight flickering off the gun barrels. Ahead, the jet's trail dipped lower, angling toward the deck, and Jack followed, easing the throttle again, feeling the aircraft tremble under strain. The altimeter ticked down 17,000 feet, then 15,000, 500 each, 100 feet, a promise that this might be the moment when propellers could catch fire with pride again. He stole a glance at the fuel gauge, needle hovering near the red. 15 minutes left if he stayed in combat power. The math didn't work. but neither did surrender. "Stay on him," Jack muttered, though no one could hear. His gloved hand tightened on the stick, and the Mustang's wings flexed slightly, whispering through thin air as if urging him on. Behind him, sunlight poured through a thin veil of cirrus clouds, painting the whole sky in bronze. To the west, 3 Mustangs still held formation, dots of silver against the horizon, waiting for orders that would never come in time. Ahead, the Me-262 turned again, banking sharply, and for the first time Jack saw the sun flare across its swept wings, like a mirror signaling a challenge. He lowered his nose and matched the turn, heart steady now, movements precise, methodical, learned through repetition but fueled by something deeper, a quiet defiance that whispered, "If speed decides kings, then courage writes the crown." The cockpit rattled like a drum under stress, the gauges flickering as if the instruments themselves couldn't decide whether to believe what was happening. Jack's breath came slow and shallow through the oxygen mask, each inhale sharp as glass, each exhale fogging the edges of his visor. The engine roared beneath him, a living beast of pistons and fire, every vibration crawling through the seat and into his spine, syncing with the frantic rhythm of his pulse. Over the radio came a burst of overlapping voices, broken by static and panic. "Red one, you're too low, pull up. Jet on your 6. For God's sake, climb." The words collided, meaning nothing and everything all at once, a storm of fear compressed into sound. Jack barely heard them. He was watching the shimmer of the Me-262 ahead, sunlight flashing off its fuselage like a signal flare, impossible speed carving through the sky with casual arrogance. Behind him, Red 3 called out that his coolant pressure was dropping. Another voice yelled about flak bursts near the river line, but the noise was distant, detached, like the world outside had already fallen away. Inside the Mustang, the temperature rose fast, the canopy glass warm beneath his gloved fingers. Sweat trickled down his neck, soaking the collar of his flight suit, and the metallic tang of oxygen filled his mouth. The formation had scattered completely now. 4 silver fighters stretched across miles of thin air, each man fighting his own private battle against physics and fear. Jack glanced over his shoulder once and saw nothing but cloud glare. The sky had swallowed his friends. For a moment, the loneliness of altitude pressed down harder than gravity itself. He checked the clock again, 10:46 a.m., and realized 4 minutes had vanished since he'd gone after the jet. His mind tried to calculate distance, fuel, odds, but the numbers didn't matter anymore. The Me-262 banked left, cutting a wide arc that gleamed like a scythe in sunlight, and Jack followed, pulling the stick with both hands until his shoulders burned. The Mustang's frame groaned under the strain, wings flexing, the sound deep and human, like metal crying out. "Red Leader, I've lost visual," someone called. "Do you copy?" Static answered. Another voice broke through, calm but tired. "Just keep your speed. Don't chase the damn thing." Jack wanted to laugh. What else was there to do? If he slowed, the jet escaped. If he kept going, the engine might tear itself apart. Somewhere between those two choices lay whatever courage meant in the final weeks of a dying war. The altimeter dipped again 14,000 feet. The air grew denser, the horizon sharper, the ground visible now in fragments of farmland and smoke. The Mustang's wings caught the sunlight like mirrors, blinding him for a split second, and when his vision cleared, he saw the jet rolling level ahead, climbing slightly. That hesitation was everything. He pushed the throttle forward again, feeling the engine protest with a low metallic growl. The cockpit filled with the smell of oil and cordite from the gun vents, a reminder that violence was only seconds away. Somewhere in the blur of noise and motion, he heard his own voice, low and steady, whispering into the radio without thinking. "Stay with him. Don't let him go." There was no reply, only the hum of the Merlin at full power, the vibration of air compressing around a machine built to defy logic. The Mustang surged ahead, slicing through its own wake turbulence, and Jack realized the chaos had narrowed into something pure, a tunnel of sound, light, and determination, leading straight toward the impossible. Every pilot in the 8th Air Force had been taught the same doctrine, repeated so often that it became a chant, whispered before every mission. Never dive after a jet, never chase into the Sunday. Keep altitude, keep formation, protect the bombers. The flight manual turned those rules into scripture, each diagram and paragraph, a promise that order could tame chaos if you just followed it perfectly. In the training rooms at Bodney and Leiston, instructors drew the same neat arrows across the chalkboard: propeller aircraft here, jet aircraft there, a clean line of avoidance separating the two, like a wall that should never be crossed. The official reasoning was simple enough. The Me-260-2 was faster by more than 100 miles per hour at combat altitude, and its acceleration curve in a dive was beyond the reach of any piston engine ever built. If a Mustang pilot followed one down, he would run out of power, altitude, and fuel long before the jet ran out of sky. The textbook said the pursuit ended there, neat and bloodless, a safe disengagement followed by another patrol. Reality was never that kind. Jack knew the numbers by heart. A P-51D, at 30,000 feet, could reach 437 miles per hour before structural vibration began to rattle the wings. The red line on the airspeed indicator 505 wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning that metal fatigue could shear control surfaces right off the frame. The Merlin engine, magnificent as it was, carried its own strict rhythm: boost pressure, mixture, prop pitch, coolant flow. Every movement of the throttle demanded a precise counteraction, like a conductor guiding a volatile orchestra through the edge of explosion. At the maintenance briefings, engineers emphasized limits with the calm tone of men who had never been in combat. They spoke of compressibility, the point where airflow over the wings thickened into shock waves that dulled control response and made every input feel delayed, like steering through syrup. In the classroom, it was a physics term. In the cockpit, it was the ghostly hand that seized the stick and dared you to fight back. Jack had heard all of it, memorized every rule, repeated them in the ready room like a prayer before takeoff. The doctrine made sense on paper. It kept pilots alive in theory, but theory never heard the sound of a jet passing within gun range, never saw tracer fire rip through formation at 700 miles an hour. In those moments, the elegant lines of the manual collapsed into instinct, and instinct didn't care about graphs or charts. Still, procedure was part of him. He checked his trim tabs, eased the prop pitch, reduced manifold pressure to maintain balance. The Mustang responded like a trained animal, steady and loyal, its laminar flow wings slicing clean through the thin air. He could almost hear the instructor's voices in his head: don't exceed 35 inches boost, don't pull more than 3 Gs, keep your radiator shutters open. Each command lined up with the next, measured, mechanical, designed to create calm amid panic. But calm had no place in pursuit. The jet ahead was pulling away again, its trail flattening into a line of vapor that mocked every regulation Jack had ever obeyed. He watched the needle on the airspeed indicator creep past 450, then 470, the hum of the engine turning into a howl. The rules said stop, the body said hold, the war said go. Somewhere inside the roar, he caught a memory of his instructor's final words back in training. The manual tells you what's safe, not what's possible. The phrase echoed against the rattle of the canopy, fading as the Mustang began to descend again. Procedure had guided him this far, but in the next breath, he knew it would no longer be enough. Every doctrine the Air Force printed carried an invisible assumption, one born from calm skies and predictable machines. It assumed that speed existed only on paper, that acceleration curves and horsepower ratings could define victory as neatly as a line in a manual. But in combat, the air itself was alive, shifting, punishing, breaking those numbers apart with every gust of turbulence. The Me-262 wasn't unbeatable because of its design alone. It was unbeatable because everyone believed the math more than they believed their own instincts. The hidden flaw was simple and cruel. Jet engines took time to breathe. When a German pilot throttled back during a dive, the turbines spooled down, bleeding momentum like sand through a glass timer. To regain power, the compressor blades had to rebuild pressure 3, sometimes 4 full seconds of silence before thrust returned. That pause was everything. It meant that, at the bottom of every high-speed maneuver, the jet hung suspended in the air, coasting on inertia while its engines waited to come alive again. No manual mentioned that gap. The instructors called it insignificant under combat conditions, a phrase that looked tidy in reports written far from the front. But the men who faced those jets learned the truth the hard way. A split second of hesitation could turn the hunter into prey, and a pilot with the courage or madness to push his aircraft into that window could close the distance before the turbines screamed back to life. Jack had seen it happen once before, months earlier, during a bomber escort over the Ruhr Valley. A friend, Captain Drew Williams, had broken formation chasing a jet that overshot its pass. The others cursed him for it, certain they'd watch another Mustang vanish into a contrail of regret. Instead, Drew fired at point-blank range and sent debris spiraling through the haze. Later, on the ground, he couldn't explain how it worked, only that he'd seen the jet stall in the air like a bird forgetting how to fly. The engineers dismissed it as luck, But luck didn't smell like burnt fuel in victory. That memory burned now, as Jack watched the Me-262 dip again, just a little too sharply. He understood, without words, that the jet's pilot had made the same mistake. Too much throttle, too steep an angle, engines starving for air. The Germans' advantage wasn't absolute. It was fragile, like glass stretched thin over fire. The war had been teaching that lesson all along, in wrecked hangars and shredded wings, but few had listened. The manual spoke of balance, of restraint, of precision. They said the key to survival was control, yet control meant obedience. And obedience had cost more pilots their lives than any technical failure. The true weapon wasn't machinery. It was understanding where the limits truly lived, and what happened if you stepped just beyond them. Jack adjusted his mixture slightly, watching the manifold pressure climb. The Merlin engine responded instantly, smooth and eager, the opposite of the jet's long, breathless pause. Beneath him, the air thickened as the Mustang dove again, each vibration humming through the pedals like a heartbeat counting down. He thought of Drew's words over whiskey weeks ago. Every machine hesitates somewhere. Find that hesitation, and you'll find your victory. He could feel that hesitation now, not in the Mustang, but ahead of him in the Me-262's faltering rhythm, in the ghostly lag of power returning. The flaw wasn't mechanical anymore. It was psychological, built into Doctrine itself. The Germans trusted their speed, the Americans trusted their rules, but Jack had decided to trust only what he could feel through the stick in his hand. And right now, that feeling said the sky's fastest predator had just blinked. Jack tightened his grip on the control stick, feeling the worn leather bite into his gloves, as if the machine itself demanded a decision. The altimeter spun past 13,000 feet, the numbers blurring into motion, and the Me-262 ahead began to level out, engines coughing faint trails of smoke that shimmered in the sunlight like broken glass. Every instinct drilled into him during years of training screamed to break off, climb away, and report the contact. Every line of the manual told him the same thing: stop before physics turned against you. But the war was almost over. The sky littered with wreckage of men who had obeyed the rules too faithfully. He pulled the throttle forward until it hit the metal gate, the detent snapping like a rifle bolt. The Merlin engine roared, its pistons hammering in perfect rhythm, propeller tips blurring into a silver halo. The sound filled the cockpit, alive and furious, the kind of noise that swallowed doubt. The Mustang's nose dipped, the horizon tilting upward as he pushed into a dive steeper than any chart permitted. At first, the aircraft resisted, heavy on the stick, sluggish as if trying to save itself from its own pilot. Then the air caught the wings, the drag screamed, and everything accelerated into violence. At 480 miles per hour, the control surfaces stiffened, each adjustment requiring the strength of both arms. The canopy rattled, bolts whining, the frame trembling in protest. He could feel compressibility creeping up from the tail, a subtle vibration turning into a deep shudder, the edge of aerodynamic collapse. Still, he held it, teeth clenched, body pinned against the seat by the invisible weight of speed. His breathing turned mechanical, shallow, and timed with the heartbeat of the engine. The Me-262 was growing larger now, its sleek outline resolving into sharp edges, the twin nacelles trailing faint exhaust spirals. Jack could almost read the swastika on the tail as the range closed, 2,000 yards, then 1,500, the gap shrinking faster than logic allowed. The jet's pilot tried to pull away, banking hard right, but the turbines hesitated the flaw, revealing itself like a crack spreading through glass. The Mustang responded instantly, diving harder, the airspeed indicator trembling near 505 miles per hour, the red line of impossibility. Inside the cockpit, the world narrowed to a single tunnel of motion, the target ahead, the roar behind, and nothing in between. His left hand steadied the throttle, his right pulled gently to correct the roll. The stick felt like iron, immovable, but he coaxed it with tiny motions, learned from years of mechanical intimacy, the same way he might tune an engine rather than fly a weapon. The jet flared, overshooting slightly, and Jack saw the flash of sunlight off its canopy, a perfect aiming cue born of mistake. He aligned the gun sight, the reticle floating steady despite the tremor of the wings. At 400 yards, he squeezed the trigger, and the 50 caliber Brownings roared in unison, a hammering symphony of thunder that shook the cockpit. Spent casings clattered down the fuselage, smoke filling the cabin with the acrid scent of cordite. The tracers stitched upward through the air, glowing threads cutting across the sky, and then one found home. The jet erupted in a burst of orange flame, a single clean explosion that flashed once, and then disintegrated into falling fragments. For a heartbeat, everything went silent. The vibration faded, the air smoothed out, and only the ticking of the cooling engine filled the void. Jack exhaled slowly, the breath catching somewhere between disbelief and awe. He had just done what every regulation swore was impossible, chased down and killed a jet in a prop-driven plane. The rules had bent, the numbers had lied, and for the first time in years, the sky felt honest again. For a long moment, the explosion ahead seemed to hang in the air, suspended between fury and silence, a frozen blossom of orange fire that turned the thin clouds into molten glass. The Me-262 disintegrated in a slow roll of debris, each fragment glinting in the sunlight before tumbling into the haze below. Jack's eyes followed it automatically, the way a mechanic watches sparks fall from a grinding wheel, fascinated, disbelieving, too aware of what had just happened to feel it yet. The sky around him was eerily still. No radio chatter, no gunfire, just the deep, steady heartbeat of the Merlin engine recovering from its own scream. He eased the throttle back, the airframe creaking as if sighing with exhaustion, and the vibration that had filled every nerve slowly faded into quiet. The airspeed indicator dropped below 400, the controls softened, and the Mustang leveled itself obediently, as though grateful to have survived its own rebellion. Jack could smell hot oil and burned powder through the vents, the metallic tang of victory mixing with the scent of risk. It wasn't triumph that hit first, it was the realization that the aircraft still held together, that the wings hadn't torn off, that gravity had shown mercy for one more minute. He looked over his shoulder, expecting to see his formation somewhere in the sun glare, but the horizon was empty. The others had scattered long before, swallowed by cloud and chaos. For the first time, he was truly alone over Germany, a single fighter in an ocean of sky, the wreckage of a jet falling below like a punctuation mark at the end of a long sentence. His radio hissed with static until a voice finally broke through, cracked, distant, full of disbelief. "Red One, confirm kill? Repeat, confirm?" Jack pressed the switch, his voice steadier than he felt. "Confirmed. Jet down. Repeat, jet down." The words sounded unreal, too clean for what they meant. On the other end, someone let out a low whistle, the kind of sound men made when truth stepped outside the limits of reason. Then came laughter, short, nervous, rising in pitch until it carried something like relief. "You're kidding, right?" another voice said. "A prop? Took down a jet?" Jack didn't answer. He just looked at the smoke trail fading below, thin as pencil lead, curling into the clouds like the end of an old myth. The calm that followed was heavier than the fight itself. Adrenaline drained from his hands, leaving them numb, and the tremor in his fingertips felt like echoes of the machine still vibrating through his bones. The Mustang's gauges steadied coolant normal, oil pressure stable, manifold within limits, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. But in the hollow space between engine beats, he knew everything had changed. The air no longer belonged entirely to progress. It still answered to courage. He banked gently toward the west, setting course for home, and sunlight slid across the canopy, illuminating the scratches and fingerprints etched into the glass from months of missions. They looked like constellations, tiny reminders of every time the aircraft had survived what it shouldn't. Below, the wreck of the Me-262 burned on the edge of a riverbank, black smoke rising into the same wind that carried him home. For a fleeting second, Jack wondered if the German pilot had seen him before the impact, if he had realized that the thing closing in wasn't another jet, but a machine from an older world refusing to die quietly. Maybe he had. Maybe that was why the last turn had been too late. He exhaled, long and slow, letting the oxygen mask fall against his chest. The war was ending, but up here, in the thin air above reason, victory didn't sound like cheers or music. It sounded like a single engine, still running, after proving the impossible wrong. For days afterward, the engineers at the airfield argued over what had happened. Each man convinced the story was either impossible or exaggerated, yet none could explain the gun camera footage that showed a P-51 diving at a speed no manual dared to record. They gathered around the projector in the dim hangar, smoke curling above the reels, watching the grainy frames flicker across the wall. The silver Mustang hurtling downward, tracers arcing ahead, the jet bursting into fire. Every time the film reached its end, someone rewound it in silence, trying to spot the moment when physics should have failed but didn't. The answer wasn't magic, nor madness, but a set of details that had always been there, hidden in plain sight. The P-51's laminar flow wing, thin, elegant, almost fragile in appearance, was designed to delay drag far longer than standard airfoils, keeping airflow smooth even when pressure changes clawed at its surface. The engineers at North American Aviation had gambled on that principle in 1940, believing that if they could reduce turbulence by even a fraction, the aircraft would gain 10 to 15% more efficiency at high speed. On paper, it looked like theory. In practice, it became survival. Then there was the Meredith effect, a quiet miracle of engineering that turned heat into thrust. The Mustang's radiator scoop, that distinctive belly intake curving beneath the fuselage, didn't just cool the engine, it converted the hot exhaust air into a stream of expanding gas, producing up to 300 pounds of forward force at full power. Most pilots never noticed it. They only felt the plane accelerate slightly when coolant temperatures rose. But on that day over Germany, when Jack pushed the Merlin to its limit, the radiator reached peak pressure, turning waste heat into the breath that carried him those final 100 yards. Add to that the engine itself. The Packard-built Rolls Royce Merlin V16507, a 12-cylinder symphony of precision, capable of maintaining full boost pressure at 25,000 feet. Its two-stage, two-speed supercharger delivered constant airflow where other engines gasped. When Jack dove, the airflow compressed, the mixture stayed rich, and the power curve remained steady, even past the red line. Every mechanical part, the pistons, the valves, the propeller pitch gears, worked together like a choir, perfectly in tune, for one defiant verse. What the manuals never said, what the engineers couldn't quantify, was the human variable that tied all those numbers together. The Mustang was a machine of balance, responsive to touch, alive to subtlety, and Jack had spent years learning its language through maintenance logs, checklists, and the rhythm of takeoff runs at dawn. He understood the way it whispered warnings through the stick, how the wings trembled when approaching drag divergence, how the engine's tone shifted half a note just before overheat. That instinct, built from repetition and risk, turned calculation into reflex. When the analysts finished their reports, they concluded that the dive had been technically survivable, though not recommended. They measured the forces, the G-loads, the temperature rise, and found everything still within the outer edge of tolerance. But between those cautious lines lay the truth no equation could capture. The P-51 hadn't defied its design, it had fulfilled it completely, just further than anyone had dared to try. Jack read that report once in the briefing tent, the paper still smelling of ink and aviation fuel. He smiled at the final sentence. Further testing, unnecessary. The engineers were done chasing explanations, but he knew the real reason would never fit inside a technical file. The Mustang had been built by people who believed perfection wasn't about safety margins. It was about faith in what metal could do when courage met design. And somewhere between that courage and that design, on one quiet morning in April, the impossible had finally lost its meaning. By the end of April 1945, rumors about the Mustang that caught a jet had spread across every flight line from England to Italy, whispered in ready rooms and mess halls like some mechanical legend that no one dared to put in writing. The official reports still used careful phrasing, one Me-262 destroyed under unusual combat conditions, but pilots preferred simpler words. They called it the dive. To them, it wasn't just a story about luck. It was proof that even at the edge of technology, courage could still rewrite the manual. In the debriefing tents of the 356th Fighter Group, crews replayed the event again and again, tracing the dive path on crude maps laid out over crates of ammunition. Chalk lines crisscrossed Germany like veins of risk, and every new squadron arriving from training listened to the tale of Jack Reynolds, the man who had pushed the Merlin beyond reason and brought a jet down from the clouds. The mechanics, who usually stayed silent during pilot talk, leaned in too, nodding when someone mentioned the tension in the control stick, the vibration at 505 miles per hour, the sound of the wings just before compressibility took hold. They knew what that meant because they had felt it in the metal under their hands. A week later, an operations officer from 8th Air Force Intelligence arrived at the base, carrying a folder marked Technical Intercept Data, P-51, divided by Me-262 engagements. He asked questions in the calm tone of a man sent to collect anomalies for headquarters. How steep was the dive? What altitude did it start? Was the aircraft modified? Jack answered honestly. No tricks, no special parts, just instinct and timing. The officer took notes, nodded once, and said the phrase every pilot longed to hear, but rarely did. We'll circulate it. Within a month, the tactic had a name. They called it Dive-Intercept Protocol, and it appeared in a thin supplement to the Fighter Combat Manual, printed on coarse paper that smelled faintly of fuel and carbon ink. The description was dry. almost reluctant. Under specific conditions, P-51 units may initiate a high-speed dive engagement against jet aircraft exhibiting throttle lag. It was only one paragraph, buried between fuel consumption charts and radiator management notes, but it meant everything. Pilots across Europe began practicing controlled dives under supervision, learning to balance speed with restraint, to recognize the precise pitch where lift surrendered to velocity. The training officers insisted it was purely experimental, but the veterans knew better. The war was ending, yet doctrines were already being rewritten for the wars that would follow. For Jack, it felt strange to see his desperate gamble reduced to procedure. He watched younger pilots rehearse the maneuver over the airfield, their silver Mustangs looping in and out of the clouds with mathematical precision. Each dive looked clean, rehearsed, safe, the opposite of the chaos he had lived through. But every time one of them leveled out perfectly, leaving a white arc of vapor hanging in the air, he couldn't help smiling. Somewhere between regulation and rebellion, a new kind of flight had been born. When the first copies of the updated manual arrived from headquarters, the cover bore the words 8th Air Force Tactical Amendments, Spring 1945. Inside, beneath fuel charts and armament tables, one footnote carried a single name. Field reference, Lieutenant Jack Reynolds, 356th Fighter Group. He ran his thumb over the line, almost embarrassed, as if touching someone else's story. Outside, the hangar doors were open to the setting sun, and the sound of engines echoed faintly across the field. Mechanics were tuning Merlins for the next patrol, each rev a heartbeat of the war's final days. The sky beyond glowed amber, peaceful now, but inside every pilot's mind the lesson burned clear. Rules could be rewritten if you lived long enough to prove them wrong. In the years that followed, the story of the Mustang that caught a jet became one of those strange corners of history that no one could fully explain, but everyone wanted to believe. The official record filed by the 8th Air Force listed the kill in plain, almost clinical language enemy aircraft, Mi-262, destroyed at approximately 10:47 hours, April 10th. O 1945, pilot Lieutenant Jack Reynolds. There was no mention of red lines crossed, no hint of what happened inside that cockpit when procedure gave way to instinct. The archivists didn't need drama, they needed order. Yet the truth lived between those lines, humming quietly like the engine that refused to quit. When the war ended, the report was boxed with hundreds of others and shipped to a records warehouse in Ohio, where it sat for decades among files marked operational anomalies. Historians stumbled upon it in the 1,970 seconds while researching jet engagements, puzzled by the single footnote attached to the case. It referred to a test conducted by Rolls-Royce engineers in 1946, measuring structural integrity of P-51 airframes subjected to high-speed dives. The results confirmed what the gun camera footage had hinted. Under rare but achievable conditions, the Mustang could sustain speeds up to 505 miles per hour without catastrophic failure. The engineers called it compressibility tolerance extension, a phrase so clinical it disguised the miracle beneath it. By the time the report was declassified, most of the men who had flown those missions were gone. Their stories survived in fragments, logbook entries, faded photographs, and the faint smell of oil that never quite left the paper. A documentary crew from the BBC interviewed one surviving mechanic in 1984. He was old by then, his hands trembling as he spoke, but his eyes brightened when the interviewer mentioned the name Reynolds. "Yeah," he said softly. "I remember the talk. We checked that plane after he landed. No cracks, no buckles, not even a loose rivet. I don't know what he did up there, but the bird came back whole." The film aired once, late at night, buried between segments on Normandy and the fall of Berlin, yet aviation enthusiasts noticed. In the following years, warbird restorers began recreating high-speed tests, carefully measuring control stiffness and airflow under conditions similar to that fateful dive. Every time the instruments reached 490 miles per hour, pilots reported the same sensation, a deep hum through the wings, like a heartbeat inside the metal. They called it the Reynolds tone, half joking, half reverent, the sound of courage brushing against physics. In 1995, at a small museum in Duxford, a retired engineer presented a paper on legacy aerodynamics of World War II fighters. He showed a slide comparing the P-51's radiator scoop to the jet intakes of early Cold War aircraft, proving that the Meredith effect had inspired post-war designers more than they ever admitted. On the final slide, He included a photo of Reynolds' Mustang in flight, its nose dipped slightly, sunlight burning across its wings. Beneath it, a single caption read, "First to prove speed is not a number, but a choice." By then, the legend had already outgrown its documentation. Veterans told the story not as myth but as inheritance, a quiet lesson passed to every new pilot who believed manuals were limits instead of starting points. And somewhere in a sealed archive box, still faintly smelling of dust and hydraulic fluid, lay the faded carbon copy of that report, its last line underlined in blue pencil by some anonymous clerk who must have paused before moving on. It read simply, "Engagement verified, performance within acceptable tolerance." The clerk never knew it, but that dry phrase became the final testimony of a moment when history blinked and reality widened just enough for one man and one machine to slip through. By the time the next generation of fighters took to the air, the sound of the Merlin engine had already faded into nostalgia, but its echo lived inside every jet that followed. The sleek fuselages of the Cold War carried more than metal and mathematics. They carried the memory of that single April morning when courage had outrun its own era. Designers who once studied laminar flow on the Mustang's wings later used the same principles to shape the leading edges of the F-86 Sabre, the swept-wing pioneer that would dominate the skies of Korea. They talked about Reynolds' dive not as legend but as data, proof that airflow and instinct could coexist inside the same cockpit. At Edwards Air Force Base in the early 1950 seconds, test pilots read those old reports like sacred text, curious how far metal could bend before it broke. The names on the hangar boards had changed, but the philosophy was the same. Understand the limit, then fly through it once to see what truth lies beyond. Chuck Yeager himself, when asked about the first time he pushed the Bell X-1 past the sound barrier, mentioned the P-51 with a quiet smile. "That airplane taught us not to trust the manuals too much," he said. "She always had a little more to give if you asked right." Across airfields and museums, restored Mustangs continued to fly, their polished aluminum reflecting the sun like liquid mercury, each engine note a heartbeat from a world that refused to stay buried. Airshow crowds called them warbirds, but to the men who maintained them, they were testaments, living machines that carried the fingerprints of the mechanics, the engineers, and the pilots who had once gambled with physics. The younger crews who tuned the Merlins before every flight still followed the same ritual: a slow prime, a cautious throttle, a glance skyward before ignition. When the propeller spun and the engine caught with that deep, rolling growl, it felt less like starting a machine and more like waking something ancient. In the archives of the Smithsonian, the original gun camera film from Reynolds' mission was finally restored. The first frame flickered, grainy but clear, the Me-262 just ahead, the tracers rising, the flash. The footage lasted only 17 seconds, yet within those seconds lived an entire philosophy of flight. That progress is never just about invention, but about defiance. Historians describe the film as a mechanical poem, an unintentional metaphor for the transition from piston to jet, from instinct to automation. For Jack, who lived long enough to see the dawn of supersonic flight, the sound of turbines never replaced the comfort of the propeller's steady rhythm. In interviews, he spoke little of his victory and more of the airplane itself. "It wasn't me," he said once, sitting beside a restored P-51 painted in his old markings. "It was the people who built her, the ones who believed metal could think if you listened close enough." When he passed away in 1982, his ashes were scattered over the same patch of English countryside where his squadron had once launched their missions. A single Mustang flew overhead that morning, dipping its wings twice before disappearing into the clouds. Witnesses said the engine note seemed to linger long after the plane was gone, echoing against the quiet hills like a heartbeat refusing to fade. And somewhere in that sound, between piston rhythm and the distant whine of turbines, the legacy of the P-51 endured. Not as a relic of war, but as a reminder that invention begins where fear ends, and that sometimes the sky bends for those who dare to chase it. In the end, war always leaves behind more than wreckage. It leaves lessons written in metal, in memory, and in silence. The sky over Europe has long since healed, its contrails gone, its thunder quieted, but if you listen carefully on clear mornings, when the air is cold and still, you can almost hear the faint hum of something ancient like a heartbeat echoing through the clouds. It's not the sound of the Merlin itself, nor the roar of the Me-262's turbines. It's the sound of defiance, the same whisper that drove men like Jack Reynolds to push a fragile machine beyond every line drawn by fear. Courage, in its purest form, was never about victory. It was about motion, the refusal to stop moving even when reason demanded surrender. For every aircraft that fell from the sky, there was another that kept climbing, carried not by luck or doctrine but by the will of a pilot who believed limits were only suggestions written by the cautious. The manuals had said, "Never chase a jet," but someone did. And because he did, generations learned that progress is born not from perfection, but from the courage to fail loudly and survive. The P-51 was never supposed to be immortal, yet its silhouette still cuts through the air at airshows and museums across the world, each flight a small resurrection. Children look up and see a symbol of speed, of power, of victory, but the veterans see something quieter, a conversation between man and machine, between faith and physics. They know that what keeps that airplane aloft isn't fuel or thrust alone. It's memory, discipline, and the lingering belief that anything built with purpose can outlast the fear that built it. When historians speak of the Second World War, they mention strategies, casualties, and nations reshaped by fire. Yet hidden within those vast narratives are the smaller stories, the moments where one mechanic tightened a cable a fraction too far, or one pilot ignored a rule because instinct whispered louder. Those choices rarely make the textbooks, but they change the course of every manual written afterward. The sky itself remembers, because every contrail ever drawn carries a trace of the one before it. As decades passed, the name Jack Reynolds faded from rosters and reports, but the act remained a line in the air too high to erase. His dive, reckless and precise, became the bridge between eras, the instant where courage turned into data and data turned into doctrine. For all the wars that followed, that single truth endured. Technology might define what is possible, but it's the human heart that decides what's real. And so, when the last surviving Mustangs lift into the twilight, their propellers glowing red in the sinking sun, it feels less like nostalgia and more like testimony. Each turn of the blade repeats a vow older than the machines themselves that speed is not the enemy of thought, and rules are not the guardians of truth. Because in war, as in life, it is never strength that shapes destiny. It is the willingness to lean forward into the wind, to trust the trembling of metal beneath your hands, and to whisper to the impossible, "Follow me." Then, and only then, does the sky open, not as a battlefield, but as a promise kept between those who dared to reach for it.